Okay, we're about ready to start our second lesson in our sewing school. Now, before we get started on fabric, let's take a look at just learning to sew a straight line. So I just got a regular piece of lined paper. I don't have my machine threaded. I don't even have a bobbin in my sewing machine. So, but what I'm going to do, your presser foot, there's a lever in the back here, so you'll put your presser foot down. Now, you see how there's a line right here on my paper? I put it right in the center of my foot, and that's where the needle goes down. So that's what your target is. So what I'm going to do is I have my foot pedal down on the floor, and I'm going to just very slowly, I'm going to try to just sew right on that straight line. All right, and then when I get to the end of my paper, I'm going to make sure that my needle is down. I'm going to lift my presser foot up. I'm going to turn my paper. I'm going to sew over to the next line and do the same thing. So all I'm doing is trying to practice sewing a straight line. And this is actually a very important technique, is learning to turn the wheel, which is right here. Or see how I turn that with my hand? I turn it towards myself. All right, always turn the wheel towards you. And getting my needle down. Okay, see, my needle is down. Lifting my presser foot back up. Turning. You use this a lot in sewing when you want to have very accurate corners. And then sewing to the next line, making sure my needle is down. Turn it around and just keep trying to sew right on that line. All right? So let's take a look and see what I have. All right, you see how I've done pretty good keeping it right on the line and sewing in between those. So do some practice. You might just want to do up a whole sheet. When you're first learning to sew, this is one thing I remember. I always had the hardest time remembering to put my presser foot down. So you need to practice that. When you finish, you push the presser foot up. When you get started, you push the presser foot down. When you have your machine threaded and your bobbin in and you forget to put that presser foot down, it causes it to just get all messed up. So this is a really important skill, to remember to put that down when you sew and to push it back up when you're finished. So that's your first practice. All right, so now I'm ready to sew. I have threaded my sewing machine. I put my bobbin in. Yours might look different, probably will. But one thing that we need to learn to do is using our hand wheel over here on the side. We're going to turn it towards us. All right, we're going to do one complete stitch. So when my needle is all the way up, I'm going to gently pull on this thread. And do you see that little loopy thread that came up? That's my bobbin thread. So now I'm going to pull that bobbin thread. I'm going to take both of my threads, and for my machine, I push them to the back. Some people it's to the side, some people it's to the back. All right, so now my bobbin thread is up. Now, my machine is ready to sew. So I could just sew like this and have a nice stitch. Let me show you. So here's the back, looks beautiful. Here's the front, it looks beautiful. Now, remember I told you, you have to remember to put that down. Let's just take a look and see what happens when I forget to put this down. So it's up and I start to sew. See, it doesn't work good. And it just causes all kinds of trouble. Let's see what it looks like in the back. Oh boy, that's really bad. So you'll do this quite a few times before you remember to put your presser foot down. So always remember, presser foot has to go down. and then we can sew. So I cut my thread too short and it came unthreaded, but you get the point. Put your presser foot down. Okay, so what I want you to do is to get 2 pieces of fabric. It can be scraps. You could even cut them out of some clothing that you don't want anymore. You just need 2 strips of fabric. We're going to do what's called right sides together. So this is the pretty side of the fabric, the right side. We're going to put right sides together. We're going to put it under our machine, all right? And then we're going to just sew. And we're just going to test out our machine. So we're just going to sew down this fabric, getting used to how it feels, all right? So we're at the end of the fabric. I use the hand wheel to put my needle up. I'm going to lift my presser foot. I'm going to cut nice long tails so that it doesn't come undone. I'm going to check the front and the back, make sure it looks good. Now this tells me I have my sewing machine threaded correctly and that I have my bobbin in correct. Now, if you have purchased an older sewing machine from a friend or someone gave you a sewing machine and your sewing machine isn't sewing like this, if the friend is still available to help you learn how to thread it, that would be great. On my sewing machines, I take them in, the one that I use the most, I take it in once a year, every year, and have it cleaned, oiled, and adjusted. And it's just like going to the dentist, you know, when you walk out and your teeth are clean and everything just feels so good and it looks so good. This is what it will look like, your sewing machine, when you come out from the shop, all right? If you're having trouble, take your machine in and have it serviced. Now, if you've purchased a brand new machine, it shouldn't need to be serviced. You just need to figure out what you're doing that's not quite right. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you now are able to sew a nice straight line. You've practiced, and you might want to do this several times, practicing putting your foot up and down and all of that. So now we're going to move on to the next thing. All right, do you remember when we were sewing on our lines on the paper? And so we knew we were going straight because we had that little line to look at. Well, when we sew with our sewing machine, we have lots of options. Do you see these lines here? This is called the throat plate of my sewing machine. And this particular one, it has 1/2, 5/8, 3/4, and then 1 inch right over here. So what that tells me is when I put my fabric in my machine and I put the side of it right over here, so it goes right up to that 1/2 inch, that tells me that between my needle right here and the edge of this fabric is exactly 1/2 inch. All right. My patterns, I use 3/8 of an inch, and that is for this particular foot. This is called a foot on your sewing machine. From my needle to here is 3/8 of an inch. Okay. So sometimes, especially in quilting, you want to use a 1/4 inch, and a 1/4 inch is over here someplace, and you see how I can't really line it up with this foot. Sewing machines come with different feet that you sew with, so you can take this, and for mine you just unscrew this and this little foot comes off and you can put a different foot on. There are feet that come so that from the needle to this edge of your foot is a 1/4 inch. Okay, that's really complicated and it's a lot to know. But for our purposes today, I'm going to be sewing 3/8 inch using the side of my foot to make my stitch line. So what that would look like is I'm going to put it right on the side. I'm going to put my needle down, And when I sew, I'm going to make sure that fabric stays right at the side of my foot. See how that works? So that's a perfect 3/8 inch seam. Perfect, nice and straight, 3/8 of an inch. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot. When you get sewing, you'll say, well, what difference does it make if I use a 1/4 inch or a 3/8 inch? Some patterns call for a 5/8 inch, which is clear over here. For every 1/4 inch that you're off when you make your seam, so let's just say I'm going to sew a 1/2 inch seam now, or excuse me, 5/8. All right. See the difference between the 3/8 and the 5/8 inch seam? Remember, on your seam, you would double that. So you have just made that seam a 1/2 inch smaller because it's a 1/4 inch on this side and a 1/4 inch on that side. So when you're reading your patterns, it's really important to know what the designer wants. Do they want you to use a 3/8 inch seam, a 5/8 inch seam, or a 1/4 inch seam? Okay? Because it does add up over the whole pattern if you use the wrong gauge, the wrong size. Okay, so like I said, this is a 3/8 inch seam. So it's a little bit hard at first to be able to kind of gauge where you need to go. I'm going to show you a little trick. I just took a piece of painter's tape, and I like painter's tape because it's not super sticky. And it's not going to hurt the finish of my sewing machine. And I just put that at a 1/2 inch to show you. So if you had a pattern that said that you're supposed to sew a 1/2 inch seam, I would put my edge right up next to that, and I can line it up even down here, okay? And then just sew like so. So it helps me keep it nice and straight and right at a 1/2 inch. All right, so what I would like for you to do on your homework for this is to practice sewing a 3/8 inch, a 5/8 inch, a 1/2 inch seam. And the way I put this on is I lined it up with my 1/2 inch line, made sure the top was lined up and the back was lined up, and then just put it down like this. All right, so do a little bit of practice and look in your box and see how wide your foot is. And oh, I should have showed you how I determined that. You can use a ruler, and you could put your needle down and measure over like that. That's a little bit hard. The other thing is you could use your little ruler and measure, all right, like that. So you can see that this is 1, 2, 3/8 of an inch, all right, and then down here I did my 5/8. So you can see that's a 5/8 inch seam. All right, so if you have a ruler that's divided into 8ths, you can count them up. The other thing is, you don't need to go out and buy anything, but if you have access to one of these, see, that tells me that's exactly a 5/8 inch seam. And here, this one tells me that that's a 3/8 inch seam. Okay, so it's really important that you learn how to do the proper width on your sewing. So that is your homework for today, is to look it up, maybe try this trick, and learn to sew nice straight lines at the proper width. Okay, so now you're getting pretty good at sewing a seam down the side of your fabric. There's something I want to show you, and it's called a backstitch. It's really important. Let me show you what happens. Okay, I'm just going to leave this at my 5/8 inch seam, just for fun. All right, so I'm going to start out, and I'm not going to backstitch. I'm just going to sew. So I'm sewing my seam all the way down my fabric. All right, now I'm just going to pull this out. I'm going to show you something. I did not backstitch at the beginning or the end of this. And when I pull this out and I pull on this, do you see how those threads start to come apart? So like if this was the top of something where I was going to attach another piece of fabric, it's already not quite right here at the top. And when you're making things get pulled and tugged all the time. And so this just kind of comes apart, and it will do it at both ends. The same, the beginning and the end. It will just start to pull apart the more it gets pulled on. All right, so there's something called a backstitch. Now, some machines are a little more fussy. It seems like, you know, you would want to start, let me push this out of the way. Okay. All right, when we're getting ready to start to sew our seam, it seems like you would just start before the fabric and just begin to sew down like that. All right, this machine does pretty good with that. My Bernina, on the other hand, it doesn't do well with that at all. And so if I start back like that, it will push this edge of the fabric down, and it gets caught in the feed dogs, which are those little things that make your fabric go forward. They go around like that. It just causes all kinds of trouble. And so you can do a little thing to boost it up. You can do all these little funky things, but here's a trick. If your machine is fussy that way, start a little bit farther down on your seam, make a stitch, and then figure out where on your machine you can make your machine sew in reverse. Then sew up to the edge and then back down. So that's one way of locking or back stitching that when you start. So let me show you what that does. This end is locked and it will not come apart. No matter how much I pull on that, it stays sewed. So that's one way to do it. Another way, if your machine isn't too fussy about where you start or how you start, is when you first start, do like 2 or 3 stitches and then just back up and then continue sewing. So now that's completely locked, back stitched. And when I get down to the end, I do the same thing. I back up 2 or 3 stitches and off the edge. So that's called back stitching. You're locking your stitch at the beginning of where you start and the end of where you start. And that is a really good practice to have. So it seems appropriate, now that I've told you how to make it so that your stitches stay nice and secure, that I show you how to take them out. So take your little seam ripper, and you'll notice it has this nice long edge, pointy edge on it. And so what I'm going to do is, working from the top side here, I'm just going to cut through some of those loops that are on one side or the other of my fabric. See, here's my back stitch I did. So now I've got that all cut out, and as you can see, it just pulls apart. And you can do the little pieces on the inside if you want to work it that way, using your seam ripper to undo that seam. Oops, sorry, I think I was too far up. You can just do it like that. Or you can continue to work here. And when you're pulling out seams, you don't have to do every single stitch. You can do every other one or whatever, because when you do every other one and you pull it, it just pulls apart. So that's how you use a seam ripper. All right, so now we know how to backstitch to make it nice and secure, and we also know how to rip it out. So I want you to practice a couple times doing a backstitch on your fabric, and then I want you to use your seam ripper and try to rip it out.